June 27, 1944. Lieutenant Lafayette Pool climbs into Sherman tank in the mood, knowing the odds. His 75mm gun cannot penetrate a Panther from the front. At any range, German 88mm guns can kill him from 2,000 meters away. The math is simple and brutal. 3rd Armored Division entered Normandy with 232 Shermans. By war's end, they'd suffer 648, completely destroyed, a 580% replacement rate. One battalion lost 51% of combat personnel in 17 days. Sherman crews called their tanks Ronsons because they lit the first time. Yet, in 81 days, Pool would destroy 258 German vehicles, including 12 tanks. He refused to fight the way Doctrine demanded. What emerged from the hedgerows of Normandy wasn't written in any manual. It was born from desperation, innovation, and the recognition that the rulebook was written for tanks they didn't have. To understand how Sherman crews rewrote armored warfare, you first need to understand the nightmare they were dropped into. Because in June 1944, American tank doctrine was about to collide with a German killing machine it was never designed to face. The problem revealed itself with mathematical precision in the first weeks after D-Day. The M4 Sherman 75mm M3 gun fired a shell approximately 13 inches long. The German Panther's 75mm KWK-42 fired a shell 28 to 30 inches long. Length wasn't just a measurement. It was destiny. That extra 15 inches translated to muzzle velocity, and muzzle velocity translated to penetration, and penetration translated to who lived and who burned. Staff Sergeant Irving Bromberg, 66th Armored Regiment, recorded the moment the reality hit home in his company. They'd spotted a German tank through the morning mist near St. Lo. Distance, maybe 900 meters? Well within their effective range, according to the manuals they'd studied stateside. The gunner acquired the target. The loader slammed a 75mm armor-piercing round into the breech. The gun barked, and then he watched it ricochet. The tracer round sparked off the glacis plate like a stone skipping on water, arcing up into the gray Norman sky. For a frozen moment, nobody in Bromberg's tank spoke. The German tank, moving with the deliberate menace of something that knows it's invulnerable, began to rotate its turret. Slowly, almost casually, the motion of a predator that has all the time in the world because its prey poses no threat. "We got the hell out of there," Bromberg wrote in his diary that night. His handwriting, normally neat, shook across the page, reversed into a tree line, and called for a tank destroyer. "The TD boys have the 90mm. We have a pop gun." He was right. The 75mm M3 gun, firing its M61 armor-piercing shell, generated a muzzle velocity of 2,030 feet per second. At 500 meters, under ideal perpendicular impact conditions, it could penetrate 68mm of armor plate. The Panther's frontal glacis armor was 80mm thick, sloped at 55 degrees. That slope increased its effective thickness to approximately 140mm. The mathematics were unforgiving. A Sherman could hammer a Panther's front armor all day and accomplish nothing except announcing its own position. The German response would come from an 88mm gun that could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor from over 2,000 meters, at typical combat engagement ranges of 800 to 900 meters. The distance at which tank battles actually occurred in the cramped terrain of France. The Sherman had to get behind or to the side of a Panther to have any chance of survival. Meanwhile, the Panther could engage from any angle, at any range, with near certainty of a kill. The crews learned this in a matter of days. What followed was a recalibration of fear. Lieutenant Colonel Albin Erzik, commanding the 8th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, would later describe the psychological shock. "Our crews had trained for 2 years, believing they had the finest tank in the world. Within a week of contact with Panthers and Tigers, that confidence evaporated. Men who'd been aggressive suddenly became cautious. They'd seen too many Shermans brew up. The euphemism couldn't hide the horror it described. When a German armor-piercing round penetrated a Sherman's armor, it entered a confined metal box, traveling at hypersonic velocity. Its path only stopped when it hit something solid enough to absorb its energy. Usually, That something was ammunition. Early production M4 Shermans stored their 75mm rounds in racks mounted along the sides of the hull, just behind the armor plate. The racks were uncovered, the shells sitting in open bins, because someone in an American design office had decided that ease of access for the loader was more important than protection. When a German shell punched through and struck one of those exposed rounds, the result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Sherman's ammunition used a granulated powder charge that, when ignited, didn't just explode, it flashed. The interior of the tank became a blast furnace in a fraction of a second. Temperatures inside reached over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews had seconds to get out, and the hatches, those circular escape routes to survival, were small and positioned in ways that required men to climb up and through them while the metal around them melted. A British study of knocked-out Shermans in Normandy found that 56.6% had burned. An American study found even grimmer numbers. Early, dry stowage. Shermans had burn rates between 60 and 80%. 4 out of 5 penetrations meant fire. British crews, with their dark humor, called the Sherman the Tommy Cooker. American crews, even darker, called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter company whose advertising slogan promised lights the first time, every time. Lieutenant Belton Cooper, a maintenance officer with the 3rd Armored Division, spent the campaign recovering knocked-out tanks and salvaging what could be saved. His memoir records scenes that haunt. Tanks with the escape hatches still dogged shut from the inside because the crew had been killed before they could turn the handles. Tanks where the only remains of the 5-man crew were small piles of ash and bone fragments that had to be swept out before the vehicle could be refurbished. Tanks where the heat had been so intense that the steel armor itself had warped and buckled. He calculated that his division entered combat with 232 M4 Sherman tanks. By the end of the war, they had suffered 648 tanks, completely destroyed and written off, plus an additional 700 damaged, severely enough to require major depot-level repairs. That was a 580% replacement rate. The same tanks, just with different crews, kept getting knocked out, repaired, and knocked out again. The machines were replaceable. The men were not, but the mathematics of American industrial production meant that there were always more men. One battalion, the records don't specify which, perhaps mercifully, lost 51% of its combat personnel killed or wounded in just 17 days between July 26 and the 12th of August 1944. 70% of its tanks were destroyed or required major repair in that same period. These weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. These were men like Staff Sergeant James Gifford, whose letters home stopped abruptly on August 3rd, or Corporal Raymond Mitchell, who survived having 2 Shermans shot out from under him before a 3rd immolation left him with burns covering 60% of his body. The fire problem was eventually addressed. Engineers developed wet stowage, a redesign that moved ammunition racks to the floor of the tank and surrounded them with water-filled jackets. If a shell penetrated, the water would, in theory, help suppress the ammunition flash. Wet stowage Shermans, designated with a W suffix like M4A176W, had burn rates that dropped to between 10 and 15%. The modification saved thousands of lives. But it came too late for the initial waves that rolled off the landing ships at Normandy. Those crews fought in the death traps, knowing that the sound of a German shell punching through armor was very likely the last sound they'd ever hear. And yet, the fire wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the range. Captain Richard von Rosen, a German Panther commander, described the dynamic in an interrogation after his capture. The Americans would advance across open ground, and we would engage them at 1,800 to 2,000 meters. Their shots would fall short or ricochet. Ours would not. They would try to close the distance, and we would simply destroy them as they came. It was less a battle than an execution. I felt pity for them. The German 75mm KWK-42 on the Panther and the infamous 88mm gun on the Tiger could reliably penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor from distances exceeding 2,000 meters. The Sherman 75mm could only reliably penetrate even a Panzer IV's armor at ranges under 900 meters, and against a Panther or Tiger, it needed to be within 500 meters and hitting side or rear armor. Think about what that meant in practical terms. In the relatively open terrain of the Falaise Gap or the approaches to Caen, a German tank commander could sit hull down behind a ridgeline, exposing only his turret and destroy approaching Shermans while they were still distant specks on the horizon. By the time an American tank crew could even acquire a target through their sights at a range where their gun might be effective, they'd already been under accurate fire for over 1,000 meters. The psychological weight of advancing toward an enemy who can kill you long before you can harm him cannot be overstated. Men weren't just fighting an enemy. They were fighting mathematics. The Doctrine, the sacred text that American armor crews had trained with for years, was Field Manual 17-33, the Armored Battalion. It had been written in 1942 based on combat experience against German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks in North Africa. Those tanks had frontal armor of 50 to 80 millimeters at modest slopes, armor that the 75 millimeters could engage with reasonable effectiveness. The manual confidently stated that American medium tanks could expect to win frontal engagements against their German counterparts through superior gun stabilization, faster turret traverse, and higher rates of fire. It was true against the Panzer IV. It was suicidal against the Panther, which Germany had fielded in mid-1943 and which now made up an increasing percentage of German armored formations. Nobody had bothered to update the Doctrine because nobody in the War Department had fully grasped how dramatically the tactical picture had shifted. The Sherman had been designed in 1940 and 1941, when the most capable German tank was the Panzer IV Ausf. F. By the time Shermans rolled onto Omaha Beach in June 1944, they were facing Panthers, Tigers, and new tank destroyers like the Jag Panther that mounted guns designed to kill Soviet heavy tanks at extreme range. The Americans had brought a 1,941 solution to a 1,944 problem. The men inside those Shermans paid the price, but the nightmare had layers. The terrain of Normandy added a dimension of horror that nobody had anticipated. The bocage, ancient Norman hedgerows that crisscrossed the countryside in a chaotic maze. Each field, often no more than 100 meters across, was surrounded by earthen embankments 4 to 6 feet high, topped with densely tangled vegetation, roots, and centuries of accumulated dirt and stone. From the air, they looked picturesque, a patchwork quilt of pastoral France. From inside a Sherman, they were a death trap. To advance, a tank had to climb over the hedgerow. The procedure was straightforward. Approach the embankment, nose up, expose the underside of the hull as the tank crested the top, then nose down on the far side. For exactly 3 to 5 seconds, the tank was motionless, climbing, with its thinnest armor, the belly plate, often only 13 millimeters thick, presented to anyone watching from the next field over. German infantry learned to wait in the neighboring fields with Panzerfausts, the handheld anti-tank rockets that could punch through 200 millimeters of armor. They'd let the Sherman commit to the climb, wait for that moment of maximum vulnerability, and fire directly into the unprotected underside. The tank would brew up before it even cleared the hedgerow. In the first week of the Normandy campaign, some tank companies lost more vehicles to infantry anti-tank weapons in the bocage than to German tanks. The crews adapted, but slowly, and at terrible cost. They learned to use infantry to clear hedgerows before attempting a crossing. They learned to use artillery and mortar fire to suppress suspected Panzerfaust positions. They learned to find gates and gaps instead of forcing their way through. But every lesson was written in the burning wreckage of M4 Shermans and the casualty reports of men who didn't make it out. By mid-July 1944, morale in some Sherman battalions had reached critical lows. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army, received reports of tank crews refusing to advance without infantry support, of men requesting transfers to infantry units because at least as an infantryman you could dig a foxhole, of tank commanders writing letters home that used phrases like, "We're sitting ducks," and "They're sending us to die." The brass couldn't dismiss these complaints as cowardice. The numbers backed them up. A study conducted by the 1st Army's Operations Research Section found that when a Sherman was penetrated and destroyed, the crew fatality rate was 24.6%. 1 in 4 crew members died. For context, infantry casualty rates in sustained combat averaged around 20%. Being in a Sherman was statistically more dangerous than being a rifleman in an infantry company assaulting a defended position. Lafayette Pool, climbing into In the Mood that June morning, knew all of this. Every tank commander knew. The question wasn't whether you could win a fair fight against a Panther. You couldn't. The question was, how do you avoid fair fights? How do you create conditions where your weaknesses don't matter and your strengths do? The solution would come from an unlikely source, a sergeant with steel scraps and a welding torch, tactics borrowed from desperate experience, and a willingness to throw away the manual and write new rules. But first, it would come from recognizing a fundamental truth that no amount of training could prepare men for. They were outgunned, outranged, and outarmored. Survival depended not on following doctrine, but on inventing something new. The Germans, watching from their Panthers and Tigers, noticed the pattern first. The Americans were no longer trying to fight them directly. Something was changing in how the Sherman crews approached combat. And what they were about to witness would force a complete reevaluation of what they thought they understood about American armored doctrine. The solution arrived in the form of a Tennessee sergeant with an idea that would seem almost comically simple in retrospect. But, in July 1944, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Sergeant Curtis Culin Jr., 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, was a tanker who'd spent enough time stuck at hedgerows, watching men die to German Panzerfausts, to become obsessed with the problem. Tanks had to climb. Climbing meant exposure. Exposure meant death. The equation needed to change. On the beaches of Normandy, stretching for miles in both directions, were the remnants of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, massive steel obstacles called Belgian gates and Czech hedgehogs that the Germans had planted to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. The invasion had swept past them. Now they sat rusting in the surf, serving no purpose. Cullen looked at them and saw something else entirely. He saw teeth. He requisitioned a cutting torch and went to work. He cut sections of the German beach obstacles into prongs thick, angled steel tusks about 3 feet long. Then he welded them to the front of his tank, angling them downward like the horns of a charging bull. The concept was brutally straightforward. Instead of climbing over a hedgerow and exposing the belly, the tank would drive through it. The steel prongs would bite into the earthen embankment. The tank's weight and power would rip through the roots and soil, and the Sherman would burst into the next field at ground level, gun already bearing on the target, no vulnerable climbing phase, no 3-second window for a Panzerfaust team to line up their shot. Cullen tested it on a hedgerow near his unit's position. The Sherman, equipped with what he'd started calling the Rhino, tore through the centuries-old embankment like it was cardboard. Dirt and vegetation exploded outward. The tank emerged on the far side without ever exposing its underside, turret already traversing, ready to engage. Word spread through the division faster than official channels could have moved it. By early July, tank crews were scavenging beach obstacles and welding their own versions. Some were crude, some were elegant. All of them worked. On July 14, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley watched a formal demonstration of the Rhino tank. Multiple Shermans, equipped with various designs of the steel prongs, systematically destroyed a section of bocage that would have taken hours to clear with conventional methods. They did it in minutes. Bradley, a man not given to dramatic pronouncements, reportedly turned to his staff and said, "I want every tank in 1st Army equipped with these." Yesterday, the order went out. Ordnance companies across Normandy began mass-producing the Rhino attachment. By the time Operation Cobra, the massive breakout offensive, launched on July 25, over 60% of Sherman tanks in the assault units had been equipped. The invention of a single sergeant, born from desperation and scrap metal, had fundamentally altered the tactical equation. The bocage, which had been a German advantage, became navigable terrain. Sherman losses to infantry, anti-tank weapons dropped precipitously. The Hedgerow cutter would save thousands of American lives in the 3 weeks that followed. Culin received the Legion of Merit. More importantly, he demonstrated something that would define the American approach for the rest of the campaign. When doctrine fails, innovate. But the Rhino was a solution to one problem. The bigger problem, German armor superiority, required a complete rethinking of how American tanks fought. That evolution happened simultaneously at multiple levels, from individual tank commanders to division-level doctrine. The 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, formalized what their crews had been discovering through trial and fatal error. The official tactical guidance, disseminated in late July, was direct. Wide, encircling movements. Engage the enemy's attention with one platoon of tanks while another platoon attacks from the rear. It was the codification of a brutal truth. You couldn't fight a Panther from the front, so don't fight it from the front. Fix it in place with suppressive fire. Your 75mm shells might not penetrate, but the sound of them impacting was psychologically effective, forcing the German crew to button up and focus on the immediate threat. While the Panther was fixated on the frontal element, a second element would use terrain, smoke, or simply speed to get to the flanks or rear. Panther side armor was 40 to 50 millimeters. Rear armor was even thinner. From those angles, the 75 millimeters was lethal. The tactic required coordination, communication, and courage. The fixing element was bait. They were the ones who had to hold the German tanks' attention while deliberately staying out in the open, drawing fire, trusting that their brothers in the flanking element would reach position before a German round found its mark. Company after-action reports from August and September 1944 are filled with notations of tanks in fixing positions, taking multiple hits, some penetrating, some not, while the flanking elements maneuvered. The cost was measured in destroyed Shermans and dead crews. But it worked. German tanks that would have been invulnerable in a frontal slugging match found themselves taking fire from angles where their armor offered no protection. The adaptation wasn't just tactical. It was also improvisational and sometimes desperate. Tank crews began modifying their vehicles in ways that field manuals never addressed. The sandbag controversy erupted in late July. Crews had noticed that the Sherman side armor, while adequate against small arms and shell fragments, offered limited protection against shape-charge weapons like the Panzerfaust or the heavier Panzerschreck. Someone records Don't Preserve who had the idea of stacking sandbags against the hull sides. The theory was that the sand would absorb and disperse the molten jet of a shaped charge, preventing penetration. Between July 18th and 24th, tanks across 1st Army began appearing with sandbags lashed to their hulls. Some crews used dozens of bags, creating makeshift applique armor that added thousands of pounds to the vehicle's weight. Engineers conducted hasty tests and found the results mixed. Against armor-piercing rounds, sandbags did nothing. The shot went through the bag, through the armor, and kept going. Against shaped charges, the effectiveness ranged from negligible to modest, depending on the spacing between the sandbag and the hull. But there was a psychological component that couldn't be quantified. Crews felt safer. Whether they actually were or not was almost beside the point. General George S. Patton, Jr., commanding 3rd Army, hated the sandbags. He issued an order banning them, arguing that the added weight reduced mobility, and that the real solution was better tactics, not makeshift protection. Instead, Patton authorized his units to weld sections of armor plate salvaged from knocked-out German tanks onto American hulls. It was heavier than sandbags, but provided actual protection. 3rd Army's tank battalions became scavengers, stripping armor from destroyed Panthers and Tigers and attaching it to their Shermans. A March 1945 study of 2 tank battalions found that the improvised armor additions had saved at least 8 tanks from Panzerfaust hits that would have otherwise penetrated. 8 tanks meant 40 crew members who went home instead of going into graves. The modifications continued. Then there was the white phosphorus discovery. The 75mm gun could fire multiple types of ammunition: armor-piercing, high explosive, and white phosphorus. WP shells were intended for artillery marking, creating a distinctive white smoke plume that aircraft or other units could use as a reference point. Some enterprising crew, somewhere in France, tried using it against a German tank not to mark the target, but to see what would happen. What happened was remarkable. The white phosphorus, burning at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, adhered to the tank's surface. The acrid, choking smoke that billowed from the burning chemical found its way into the Panther's ventilation system. More critically, the burning phosphorus obscured the German tank's optics, periscopes, vision ports, gun sights, all became useless. A Panther, blinded and with its crew coughing and struggling to breathe, was effectively neutralized even if it wasn't destroyed. The tactic spread informally through units, passed from crew to crew like a trade secret. Fire WP at a German heavy tank you can't penetrate. The smoke and burning chemical would force the crew to either withdraw or button up blind. Then you closed the distance and hit the now stationary, blinded target from the side or rear with AP rounds. It was never officially sanctioned doctrine. It simply worked. So crews kept doing it. Every destroyed Sherman was replaced within days. American logistics were that overwhelming, but the crews couldn't be replaced as easily. 5 men trained to work as a single organism, who knew each other's voices, who could load, aim, and fire in a rhythm that came from hundreds of hours together, who trusted each other with their lives, that took time to build. When a Sherman brewed up, the replacement tank might arrive within 48 hours. The replacement crew, green and unfamiliar, might take weeks to achieve the same level of cohesion. So veteran crews became increasingly valuable. Men like Lafayette Pool. Pool was an anomaly. He suffered from claustrophobia, a condition that should have disqualified him from tank duty entirely. The interior of a Sherman was 16 feet long, 8 feet wide, and packed with ammunition, equipment, and 4 other men. It was tight, hot, and when the hatches were closed, utterly confining. Most claustrophobic tankers learned to manage the fear or requested transfers. Pool refused to button up. He rode with his head and shoulders out of the commander's hatch, exposed to small arms fire, artillery fragments, and the elements, because the alternative being sealed inside was psychologically unbearable. It should have gotten him killed. Instead, it made him the deadliest tank commander in American service. The visibility from outside the tank was incomparably better than looking through periscopes and vision slits. Pool could see threats before his buttoned-up peers could. He could coordinate with infantry, he could direct his driver with precision. His crew adapted to his style. They became aggressive, fast, and opportunistic. In the Mood rolled through France like a predator that had figured out it was faster and meaner than anything it would encounter if it refused to fight on the enemy's terms. By early August, Pool had destroyed over 100 German vehicles. His most audacious move came on August 8 near Mortain, during the desperate German counteroffensive aimed at cutting off the American breakout. German armor, including Tigers from the 1st SS Panzer Corps, was pushing west in a last-ditch attempt to reach the coast. Pool's company was part of the screening force, trying to blunt the attack. A Tiger appeared at the end of a village street, its 88mm gun swiveling toward American positions. The range was less than 400 meters point-blank by armor standards, but still too far for a 75mm to reliably penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. Pool didn't try. He ordered his driver forward, directly toward the Tiger. The German crew, accustomed to American tanks trying to retreat or find cover when facing a Tiger, hesitated. In that moment of confusion, Pool closed to within 100 meters, traversed hard right, and put 3 75mm rounds through the Tiger's side armor in rapid succession. The German tank didn't explode. It simply stopped, smoke pouring from the engine deck, the crew bailing out through hatches while Pool's bow machine gunner raked the street with .30 caliber fire. It was a maneuver that violated every piece of training Pool had received, charging a Tiger. But it had worked, because the last thing the German crew expected was for the inferior tank to attack. Pool's success wasn't unique. Across France, individual tank commanders and veteran crews were developing similar approaches. Lieutenant Sidney Radley Walters, commanding a squadron of the 27th Armored Regiment, a Canadian unit attached to the British Second Army, had killed 18 German tanks by September, making him the highest-scoring Western Allied tank ace of the war. His method wasn't aggressive charges. It was the opposite: prepared positions, ambush tactics, and ruthless patience. On August 8th, the same day, Pool was dueling Tigers. At Mortagne, Radley Walters was positioned near Gaumesnil, northeast of Falaise. His squadron had taken up positions around a chateau, but instead of simply parking behind walls, Radley Walters had his crews do something unconventional. They cut firing ports directly through the chateau's stone walls. They created concealed positions inside buildings, with their guns pointed through narrow openings that made the Shermans nearly invisible from the outside. When the 12th SS Panzer Division counterattacked with Tigers and Panthers, expecting to find American tanks in conventional hull-down positions, they instead drove into a kill zone, where enemy fire seemed to be coming from the buildings themselves. Radley Walters' hidden Shermans destroyed multiple German tanks before the survivors withdrew. The Germans later reported that they'd been engaged by self-propelled guns concealed in buildings, not recognizing that they'd been fighting Shermans because no tank could possibly be inside a chateau. Radley Walters would survive the war despite having 3 tanks shot out from under him, being wounded twice, surviving a landmine that threw him from a jeep, and enduring countless engagements. His philosophy was direct. Hitting your enemy first automatically unnerves him, even if it doesn't prove fatal. The Germans knew we had faster turret traverse, 15 seconds for a full 360-degree rotation, compared to their 25 to 40 seconds. If we spotted them first and hit first, even if we didn't penetrate, we bought time to reposition or get a second shot into a weaker point. But the most comprehensive demonstration of how American armor tactics had evolved came in September 1944 at a place called Arracourt. It was here that the German High Command would learn, in brutal detail, that the Americans had stopped trying to fight the war that Germany wanted and had started fighting the war that American strengths made possible. September 18, 1944. The Third Army's advance across France had outrun its fuel supplies and ground to a halt near the German border. Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division held positions around the town of Arracourt, east of Nancy. Intelligence reports indicated that the German 5th Panzer Army was massing for a major counter-offensive Operation Ludic, aimed at retaking the critical rail junction at Nancy and cutting off Patton's spearhead units. The Germans had assembled 262 tanks and assault guns, including a significant number of Panthers. Against them, Combat Command A could field approximately 163 Shermans and a handful of M10 and M18 tank destroyers with their more powerful 76mm and 90mm guns. On paper, it was a German advantage, particularly in quality. But the Americans weren't planning to fight on paper. They were going to fight in the fog. The morning of September 19th brought a heavy ground fog that reduced visibility to less than 100 meters. Weather conditions that would normally halt operations became an American weapon. German doctrine emphasized long-range gunnery and positional defense. The fog negated range. It turned the battle into a close-quarters knife fight, where superior American reconnaissance, infantry-tank cooperation, and prepared positions would matter more than thick armor and powerful guns. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, positioned his Shermans in concealed positions overlooking the likely German approach routes. Forward observers with radios were pushed far ahead to provide early warning. Tank destroyers with 90mm guns were positioned to cover the Shermans from hull-down positions. The Americans created a defense in depth that would allow German tanks to enter the engagement area before revealing the true extent of American forces. The Germans never saw what hit them at Arracourt. The 1st Panther Company rolled forward through the fog, navigating by compass bearing, expecting to overrun American positions. Instead, they drove into a carefully orchestrated ambush. Shermans appeared from multiple directions simultaneously, some from concealed positions in tree lines, others from behind stone walls, some even emerging from farm buildings where they'd been hidden overnight. The German tanks, unable to use their range advantage, found themselves taking fire from 300 to 400 meters, often from the flank. The fog that concealed them also concealed the Americans, and the Americans knew the terrain. The engagement lasted 3 hours. When the fog lifted at mid-morning, the battlefield was littered with burning German tanks. The first day's fighting cost the Germans 14 Panthers and Panzer IVs destroyed. American losses, 3 Shermans. Over the following 10 days, the battle continued in phases. The Germans committed more armor. The Americans, reinforced by additional tank destroyer battalions and with near-total air superiority from P-47 Thunderbolts, once the weather cleared, systematically destroyed every German formation that attacked. By September 29th, when the German offensive finally collapsed, Combat Command A's after-action reports documented 86 German tanks and assault guns destroyed against 25 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers lost. It was a 3-4-1 kill ratio against an enemy with superior equipment. What happened at Arracourt wasn't luck. It was the culmination of everything American tank crews had learned since June. Use terrain, use weather, use coordination, use air support. Create conditions where your strengths matter and their strengths don't. The Sherman was faster than a Panther, more reliable, had faster turret traverse, and could be supported by artillery and aircraft in ways that isolated German tanks couldn't. American logistics could replace losses overnight. German logistics were collapsing. Arracourt proved that tactical and operational excellence could defeat technical superiority. But on September 19th, the same day the Battle of Arracourt began, everything changed for Lafayette Pool. His 81-day run through France was about to end in a way that would illustrate both the triumph and the tragedy of the Sherman tank and the men who fought in them. Pool's luck ran out near Münsterbusch, Germany. September 19th, 19448, 1 days after he'd first climbed into In the Mood. His company was probing German defensive positions when a Panther, concealed in a tree line, fired first. The round struck the Sherman's turret at an angle that should have deflected, but at close range, even a glancing blow from an 88mm was catastrophic. The shell penetrated, the interior flashed with fire and fragmentation. Pool's loader and gunner died instantly. His driver, miraculously, scrambled out through the belly hatch. Pool himself was thrown clear by the blast, but not before shrapnel had torn through his right leg below the knee. He survived. The leg didn't. Army surgeons amputated it at a field hospital in France. Lafayette Pool, the man who destroyed 258 German vehicles in less than 3 months, who'd personified the aggressive, adaptive spirit that had transformed American armored doctrine, went home to Texas with a Purple Heart, a Silver Star, and a prosthetic leg. He never spoke much about the war afterward. Friends who asked would get the same answer. We did what we had to do. What they had to do was fight with tanks that couldn't match their opponents gun for gun, armor for armor, or range for range. So, they changed the terms of engagement. They innovated. They adapted. They died in appalling numbers, but they learned, and they won. The learning continued through to the final days of the war. On March 6, 1945, in the ruins of Cologne, Germany, tank warfare came full circle. Staff Sergeant Clarence Smoyer, gunner in the M26, Pershing Eagle 7, was advancing near the Cologne Cathedral when German Panthers destroyed 2 American tanks in rapid succession. Signal Corps cameraman Jim Bates was filming from a nearby building. What he captured would become one of the most famous pieces of combat footage from the European theater. Smoyer's Pershing rounded a corner and came face to face with a Panther at less than 100 meters. For the first time in the war, American tank crews had a machine that could fight German heavy armor on equal terms. The M26 mounted a 90mm gun that could penetrate Panther armor frontally, but technology alone wasn't what won the duel. Smoyer's tactic was pure. Pool. Aggressive, forward movement. Fire. While moving, he told his gunner, "Don't stop, don't wait, just fire." 3 90mm rounds hit the Panther before the German crew could traverse their gun. The Panther erupted in flames. The crew bailed out. Bates' camera captured it all: the shots, the penetrations, the German tankers running for their lives. It was the apotheosis of what Sherman crews had been practicing for 9 months. Speed, aggression, and refusing to fight the enemy's fight. But the Pershing came too late. Only 20 reached Europe before VE Day. The war was won with Shermans, nearly 50,000 of them produced, between 1,942 and 1,945. The mathematics of American industrial production had overwhelmed German technical superiority. For every Panther Germany built, America built 10 Shermans. When a Sherman was destroyed, another arrived within 48 hours. When a Panther was destroyed, the crew was lucky if a replacement arrived within a month. The asymmetry wasn't just in combat. It was in logistics, production, training, and the fundamental philosophy of warfare. Sidney Radley Walters survived his 18 kills, his 3 destroyed tanks, his 2 wounds, his landmine, and his exploding Jeep. He went on to become a lieutenant general in the Canadian Army. In his retirement, he was asked about the Sherman. "It wasn't a perfect tank," he said, "but it was a tank we had in overwhelming numbers, that we could repair in the field, that ran reliably, and that our crews mastered. The Germans built masterpieces. We built machines. Machines won the war. The human cost of that victory was staggering." The 3rd Armored Division's 580% tank replacement rate meant that the same machines were rebuilt and put back into service with new crews after the old crews died or were wounded. 1st Army statistics recorded that 24.6% of crew members died when their tank was knocked out 1 in 4. The burn rate for early Shermans approached 80%. Thousands of men burned to death in machines that had been sent to war with inadequate armor, inadequate guns, and inadequate protection for the ammunition that would kill them when enemy shells penetrated. But those same men, Pool, Radley Walters, Culin, Smoyer, Bromberg, and tens of thousands, whose names appear only in unit rosters and cemetery headstones, had done something remarkable. They'd taken the war they were given and transformed it. When frontal assaults failed, they flanked. When hedgerows trapped them, they built steel teeth and drove through. When their guns couldn't penetrate, they used white phosphorus to blind and suffocate. When Doctrine failed, they wrote new doctrine in the margins of after-action reports and in hurried conversations between engagements. They turned the Sherman from a death trap into a weapon that helped win a war, not through superiority of design, but through superiority of adaptation. The Germans never expected this. They'd planned for a war of tigers and panthers, dominating the battlefield through technical supremacy, where superior German engineering would offset numerical disadvantages. What they got was Arracourt, fog, ambush, combined arms, and American tanks that refused to fight the way German doctrine assumed they would. They got Pool, charging tigers at point-blank range. They got Radley Walters, firing from inside chateau. They got Cullen's Hedgerow cutters turning the bocage from a German advantage into navigable terrain. They got a style of warfare that emphasized system over machine, coordination over individual dueling, and industrial might over engineering perfection. The Sherman's legacy isn't that it was better than a Panther. It wasn't. The legacy is that it didn't need to be. The M1 Abrams tank, named for Creighton Abrams, who commanded Shermans at Arracourt and led the relief of Bastogne, inherited this philosophy. Build tanks that can be produced in quantity, maintained in the field, operated by adequately trained crews, and supported by an integrated system of logistics, air power, and combined arms. The Abrams doesn't fight duels. It fights as part of a system. That's the lesson Pool and 10,000 tank commanders like him wrote in the mud and fire of France, Belgium, and Germany. They didn't win because they had better tanks. They won because they became better tankers. They refused to accept the limitations they'd been handed. They innovated under fire. They adapted or died, and enough of them adapted that the ones who died weren't dying in vain. Every burned-out Sherman that got rebuilt and sent back to the front, every field modification welded onto a hull by desperate crews, every tactic passed from veteran to replacement was part of a learning curve that ultimately proved steeper than Germany could match. The laughter from German tank commanders who'd first encountered Shermans in 1942 and 1943, who'd called them Tommy Cookers and easy kills, had stopped by 1944. By then, they were facing an American armored force that had learned from every failure, that had integrated tank destroyers, air support, artillery, and infantry into a combined arms team that was far more than the sum of its parts. They were facing men who decided that if they were going to die in inferior machines, they'd at least die fighting on their own terms. Pool survived. So did Radley Walters and Smoyer. But tens of thousands didn't. The victory was bought with their lives, fought in tanks that were fundamentally outclassed, and won through a transformation in how those tanks were employed. That transformation from seeing tanks as individual duelists to seeing them as components in a larger system, from fighting the enemy's fight to imposing your own, was the real revolution. Not a reverse tactic. Not a single brilliant innovation. But a complete reimagining of armored warfare, written in fire and blood across the battlefields of Western Europe by men who refused to lose just because their equipment wasn't as good as the enemy's. That's the story German commanders never expected. That's the tactic that destroyed not just 18 panzers, but an entire philosophy of war.